told her I had discussed it with my doctor and 1 cup was fine. She nodded in the way that meant she disagreed, but was choosing not to say so further, which was somehow more irritating than if she had just said so further. The next week, she mentioned that I looked like I was gaining weight quite quickly, and she hoped I was watching my portions because pregnancy weight was notoriously difficult to lose afterward, and she had struggled with it herself after David, and she would hate for me to go through that. She said this while I was eating lunch. I was 14 weeks pregnant. I put down my fork and picked it up again and said nothing, because I had learned that saying nothing was sometimes the only way to end a sentence Linda had started. She had opinions about my prenatal vitamins. The brand my doctor had recommended was not the brand she had researched, and she felt her research was fairly thorough. She had opinions about my birth plan, which I had not shared with her but which David had mentioned in passing, and her opinions were delivered as concerns. She just wanted to make sure I had considered all the options. She just wanted me to be informed. She just cared about my well-being. The word just did a lot of work in Linda's sentences. It was always there, softening, minimizing, making the things she was saying sound like the most reasonable observation anyone had ever offered. What changed in the 3rd month was the physical reality of the pregnancy meeting, the unchanged reality of the household. I was exhausted in a way that was different from the exhaustion of the previous 2 years. Deeper, more total. My body was doing something enormous, and my body needed rest. And rest was not something the household schedule had ever made room for, and nobody was suggesting it make room for it now. I came home from work one evening at 6:30, 12 weeks pregnant, with a headache that had been sitting behind my eyes since noon, and the sink was full of dishes and there was nothing started for dinner, and Linda was in the living room watching television. She looked up when I came in and said she had not been feeling well today. Her back had been bothering her. She hoped I did not mind managing dinner tonight. I stood in the kitchen doorway in my work clothes with my headache and my 12-week pregnant body, and I managed dinner. Afterward, washing the dishes, I became aware of a feeling I had not clearly identified before. It was not anger. Exactly, anger would have been simpler. It was the specific grief of someone who has just understood that a hope they had been carrying was not going to be realized. I had been hoping, without quite admitting it to myself, that the pregnancy would change something, that Linda would step into a different role, that the scales would shift, that someone would look at me and see that I was growing a person inside my body and decide that I had perhaps done enough. Nobody had decided that. The headache stayed for 3 days. Sarah came over on a Saturday when I was 16 weeks along. She brought food she had cooked herself, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and watched me with the particular attention she had been paying me for months. She said, "You look worse than you did before you got pregnant." I said the first trimester was hard. She said, "It's not just tired. You look like someone who is not being taken care of." I did not say anything. She said, "Where is Linda in all of this? Where is David?" I looked at my hands on the table. I said Linda had not been feeling well. I said David was busy with a project at work. I said these things in the flat tone of someone reciting facts they have decided not to feel. Sarah looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You are growing a human being. You are allowed to need things." I started crying. Not the polite kind of crying. Not the kind you can manage and redirect, the other kind. The kind that has been waiting for a long time and takes the first available moment of genuine witness to come out. I sat at my own kitchen table and cried in a way I had not cried since before the marriage, and Sarah did not try to stop it or fix it. She just stayed. When it was over, she handed me a glass of water and said, "What are you going to do?" I thought about my baby, about the person forming inside me who did not know yet what kind of world they were coming into, who was relying on me completely and without question the way only the unborn can rely on you, with a trust so total it has not yet learned to be anything else. I thought, I cannot bring a child into the version of this life I have been living. I said, I'm going to change things. The moment that completed my understanding came 3 weeks later. I had a routine appointment and my blood pressure was slightly elevated. Not alarmingly, but enough for my doctor to mention it and ask about my stress levels and suggest I try to rest more. I came home and told David and he said he was sure it was fine. These things fluctuated. I told Linda because she was in the room and she said, nodding in the way she nodded when she was filing information away, "You should watch your salt intake." Not, "Let me take something off your plate." Not, "What do you need?" Not, "I am going to make sure you rest." Salt intake. I was standing in my own living room, 19 weeks pregnant, with elevated blood pressure from a life that had been systematically stripped of everything that restored me, and the woman who had been living in my house for over a year and eating my food and benefiting from my salary and directing my spending and offering her opinion on my prenatal vitamins looked at me and said to watch my salt intake. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I put my hand on my stomach and I felt the baby move a small, unmistakable flutter, the first clear movement I had felt, and something happened in me that I can only describe as a door closing. Not on emotion, on patience, on the particular willingness to absorb that I had been practicing for 2 years and had just run out of. I thought about my daughter. I did not know yet that she was a daughter. I would not know for another 3 weeks, but I thought of her that way from that moment, and I thought, she is watching, not literally, not yet. But she is already inside the life I am building, already shaped by what I model, already learning from the inside what a woman does with her own needs and her own voice and her own limits. I was not going to model this. I did not move dramatically. I move the way I do when I have decided something completely quietly, thoroughly, without announcing it in advance. I went to the bank the following week. I redirected my salary into an account with only my name on it. I called my HR department and updated my direct deposit. I sat down that evening and built the document I'd been assembling in my head for months, every contribution I made to the household in money and labor and time, against every way the household served me in return, and I printed 2 copies and put them in a folder. Then I waited. I did not wait long. The pharmacy was 2 days later. The 50 missed calls were still going when I got home from the bank. I sat in the driveway for a moment, phone buzzing in my hand, and I looked at David's name on the screen repeating itself, and I felt very calm. Not the suppressed calm of someone pushing something down. The actual calm of someone who has set something down and felt the relief of their own hands being empty. I went inside. Linda was in the kitchen. She looked at me with the particular expression she used when something had gone wrong and she was deciding how to address it, composed on the surface with the effort just barely visible underneath. She said, "We need to talk about whatever you did at the bank." I said, "We will. When David gets home. All 3 of us." David arrived 20 minutes later, moving with the tight energy of someone who has been panicking in a contained way for 2 hours. He looked at me and started to speak, and I said, the same way I had said it to Linda, "When we all sit down." We sat down. I put the document on the table. I said, "I want to show you both something before anyone says anything." Linda did not look at the document for a long time. She looked at me instead, with an expression I recognized as the recalibration that happened when her usual approaches were not producing their usual results. The warmth was still there, but it was working harder than normal, visibly working, and that effort was its own kind of answer. David read it. I watched his face the way I had learned to watch faces in this household carefully, for the thing underneath the thing. What I saw move through him as he read was not what I expected. It was not defensiveness. It was recognition. The slow, uncomfortable recognition of someone seeing an account of something they had half known and chosen not to examine directly, and now could not choose not to examine anymore. He put the document down. He said, "How long has it been like this?" I said, "Since month 3. Linda said, "I think this is a bit of an exaggeration." David said, "Mom." She stopped. He looked at her and then at me and then back at the document and he said, "She's pregnant and her blood pressure is elevated and I haven't once asked her if she needs help. I have been watching my mother live in our house for over a year and I have not once asked my wife if that was working for her." He paused. "That's not okay. That's been not okay for a long time." Linda tried several things in the silence that followed. She tried hurt the particular wounded quality she deployed when direct warmth wasn't sufficient. She said she'd only ever tried to help, that she had given everything to this family, that she did not understand how her contributions were being characterized this way. Her voice carried the tremor of someone genuinely injured, and 2 years ago it would have worked. 2 years ago I would have softened. I would have found a way to make her feel better about what she had done to me. I did not soften. I said, "Linda, I am carrying your grandchild. For the last 2 months I have come home from work every evening and cooked dinner and managed this household with elevated blood pressure and pregnancy fatigue, and in that entire time you have not once offered to take anything off my plate. You have offered opinions about my salt intake and my prenatal vitamins and my weight gain. I want you to sit with the difference between those two things." The room was very quiet. She sat with it. And then something happened that I had not seen before and have not seen since Linda's face, that carefully maintained, expertly managed face, did something unplanned. The composure did not shatter. It just softened. Not into warmth, into something older and less certain than warmth. Something that looked almost, for a moment, like a woman seeing herself from the outside for the first time in a long time. She said, "I didn't realize." I said, "I think you did. I think you realized more than you let yourself acknowledge. But I'm not asking you to confess to anything. I'm asking you to change." Linda moved to her own apartment 6 weeks before my due date. Not dramatically, not in the heat of the conversation. That conversation ended without resolution, the way real conversations often do, with things said that needed time to settle. But in the weeks that followed, something had shifted in the house in a way that made her previous occupation of it impossible. David had changed not all at once, not completely, but in the specific way of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee and is making effort to deserve what he almost lost. He started coming home earlier. He took over the grocery run. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, to ask what I needed before I had to explain that I needed something. And Linda found her way, in the language she had always used, to something adjacent to accountability. She called one evening and she said she had been thinking, and she said that she believed she had perhaps let herself become too comfortable in our home, and had perhaps not been as mindful as she should have been. It was not an apology exactly, but it was the closest Linda had ever come to one, and I received it as such. She visited on Sundays after she moved out. She brought things for the baby. She was quieter, more careful, present in a way that was less consuming than before. She asked before offering opinions. She did not always succeed, but she asked. My daughter was born on a Thursday, 7 pounds and 2 ounces. With David's eyes and what I am told is my expression a look of calm, focused assessment, as though she arrived already deciding what to make of things. I held her in the hospital room with David beside me, and I thought about the pharmacy counter and the declined card and the 50 missed calls and the document and the conversation at the kitchen table. I thought about the Tuesday morning with the test in my hand and the feeling of something entirely mine. Everything I had done between that Tuesday and this Thursday had been for her, though she did not exist yet in a form that could receive it. Everything I had refused to keep absorbing, Every line I had finally drawn, every version of myself I had chosen not to surrender it had all been in service of arriving at this room as a whole person rather than a depleted one. As someone who knew how to hold a limit, so I could teach her what limits were for. She looked up at me with the unfocused, absolute trust of the newborn, and I made her a promise I did not say out loud because some promises are not for saying. I am not going to disappear for anyone, not anymore. Some of you will recognize the pharmacy counter, the declined card, the husband who relayed his mother's opinions instead of asking what you needed. The slow, patient, warmly delivered transfer of your own life out of your hands. The supplement cost $14 at a different pharmacy. My blood pressure is normal. My daughter is 4 months old and has, I am reliably informed, my expression. I intend to make sure she knows what it means. Standing at the pharmacy counter, my card declined on a $12 supplement. The cashier did not make a scene about it. She simply turned the screen toward me, that small, practiced tilt that pharmacy cashiers do when they need you to see something without having to announce it to the whole line. And I looked at the word declined and felt something settle in my chest. Not embarrassment, something quieter and more final than embarrassment. $12, a magnesium supplement my doctor had recommended 6 weeks ago when my blood work came back, and she sat across from me with the results and said carefully that my levels were low enough to explain the fatigue and the headaches and the way I had been waking up at 3 a.m. unable to go back to sleep. She circled the number. She said it twice. I nodded and said I would pick it up this week. 6 weeks later, I was finally standing at the counter, and my card was declining on $12. I called my husband. He answered before the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call, which meant someone had already told him I was at the pharmacy, which told me something I filed away without reacting to. He did not say hello. He said, "Mom already told me. You don't need that stuff. Stop spending on things that don't matter." I stood there with the phone against my ear and the bottle in my other hand, and the cashier looking with great focus at the middle distance somewhere past my left shoulder, giving me the privacy of her inattention. I put the bottle back. I said nothing. I walked out to the parking lot and sat in my car and looked through the windshield at the ordinary afternoon going about its business outside, and I stayed there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then I started the engine. I did not drive home. I drove to the bank. And in the 40 minutes that followed, I made every financial decision I should have made 14 months ago. By the time I got home, my phone had 50 missed calls. Not one of them started with sorry. But before I tell you about the bank, I need to tell you how I arrived at that parking lot, not the drive. The 2 years of careful, patient, expertly managed architecture that had been built around me until I was living inside someone else's design and had almost forgotten what my own looked like. I married David because he was kind. I want to be precise about this because the reason matters. I did not marry him because I was naive or desperate or not paying attention. I married him because after years of growing up in a house where warmth was unpredictable and approval had to be earned fresh every day, someone offering consistent, uncomplicated kindness felt like arriving somewhere I had been trying to get to for a long time. When you have been cold for years, warmth feels like love. I know the difference now. I did not know it then. What I also did not fully know then was that his kindness had a source, and the source was not entirely him. His mother, Linda, was 62 years old, and had spent those 62 years becoming very good at a particular thing, getting what she needed from people while making them feel that giving it was their own idea. She was not the kind of mother-in-law who announces herself as a problem. Those kinds are easy. You can name them. You can have a conversation about them. Linda operated below the threshold of anything nameable. She operated in warmth, in appreciation, in the language of family and togetherness and love, and she was so fluent in that language, had been speaking it for so long, that you had to have been watching very carefully for a very long time before you started to hear what was actually being said underneath it. I was not watching carefully enough. Not at first. I was too busy being grateful. She came to stay with us for a week, 3 months into our marriage. Her apartment needed some repairs, she said. Just a week. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a casserole and the specific energy of a woman who is very comfortable making herself at home. And she cooked dinner that first night and the second night, and by the third night I had started coming home from work an hour early to help her in the kitchen because she was doing so much and I was doing so little, and the gap between those 2 things made me feel genuinely guilty. This was the first thing she built. Guilt. Not through complaint. Linda never complained. Through visible effort. Through the pleasant tiredness she wore in the evenings like an accessory. The way she would lower herself into the armchair after dinner with a small, uncomplaining exhale that said more than any words would have. I saw that exhale, and I felt it. I was supposed to feel it. It was designed to be felt. The week became 2 weeks. The repairs were taking longer than expected, she said. Of course, we said. Stay as long as you need. By the time I understood that the repairs had been finished for some time, she had been with us for 4 months. Here is how the transfer happened. I want to describe it precisely because I think it is important to understand that it was not a takeover. Takeovers are visible. What Linda did was an installation, slow, incremental, each piece placed so carefully that by the time the whole structure was up, it felt like it had always been there. Month 1. She cooked. I helped and was grateful. Month 2. She supervised while I cooked, offering adjustments in a voice so gentle and complimentary that they felt like collaboration. You have such good instincts. Just a little more heat here. I felt capable. I felt appreciated. I cooked more. Month 3, she began having back pain on certain evenings. Nothing serious, she said quickly whenever I asked. She did not want to make a fuss, but I noticed she was moving more carefully, sitting down sooner. The kitchen had become mine to manage because clearly she needed the rest, and clearly I was capable, and clearly this was just what families did for each other. Month 4, the groceries. She had gone with me a few times, offering opinions, and then one week she mentioned casually that her knee was bothering her, and maybe I could just go myself this week. She trusted my judgment completely. I went myself. I kept going myself. The grocery run became mine without any conversation about it becoming mine. Month 6. The laundry. One Saturday she had put a load in with mine just to save a trip, she said, and I had folded everything together without thinking about it. And somehow from that Saturday forward there was simply more laundry every week, and it all went through the same machine and came out folded by me. By month 8, I was running the household. All of it. The cooking and the shopping and the cleaning and the laundry and the scheduling and the management of every domestic thing that needed managing. I was also working full-time. I was leaving the house at 8 and coming home at 6, and then spending the next 3 hours making the home function, and I was doing this 7 days a week because weekends had their own list of things. I had not agreed to any of this. I had simply never said no, which is a different thing, though it took me a long time to understand the difference. What I noticed, somewhere around month 9, was that Linda looked better. This sounds like a strange thing to notice, and I almost did not let myself notice it because it seemed uncharitable, but it was true, and it was visible, and eventually it became impossible to ignore. She had moved in looking her age, a woman in her early 60s carrying the particular weariness of someone who has been managing a household alone for years. Within months of moving in with us, she had begun to shed that weariness. Her color improved. She slept well, I knew this because she mentioned it often with the contented satisfaction of someone who is sleeping very well. She started a yoga class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because she finally had the energy for it. She reconnected with friends she had drifted from. She began going to lunches, to a book club, to a Saturday morning farmer's market with a friend named Carol who I had never met but heard about regularly. She was flourishing. I was not flourishing. I did not have a word for what I was doing. Functioning, maybe. Getting through. I had stopped going to my own gym class because I could never make the time, and then I had canceled the membership because Linda had mentioned thoughtfully that it seemed wasteful to pay for something I wasn't using. I had stopped seeing Sarah as regularly because the evenings were full and the weekends were full, and by the time I had a free hour, I was too tired to want to spend it driving across town. I had stopped reading before bed because I fell asleep the moment I lay down, which sounds like a small thing and is not a small thing. Reading before bed had been mine for 15 years, a private 30 minutes that belonged to no one else, and I had lost it without noticing exactly when. I was thinner. My colleague James mentioned it one afternoon in the break room, saying I looked like I had lost weight, and the way he said it made it clear he did not mean it as a compliment. My hair, which I had always kept well, had started looking less like itself. There were shadows under my eyes that foundation was no longer adequately covering. I looked, in short, like a woman who was pouring out faster than she was being filled. Sarah said it directly because Sarah has never in her life said anything indirectly. We finally managed coffee on a Wednesday evening, the first time we had seen each other in nearly 2 months. She looked at me across the table at our usual place, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. She said, "What is happening to you?" I said everything was fine. She said, "You have lost weight you did not have to lose. You look like you haven't slept properly in months. The last 3 times I've suggested getting together you've canceled, and the time before that you fell asleep at 9:30 on my couch. That is not fine. That is someone disappearing." I looked at my coffee. She said more quietly, "When did you last do something just for yourself? Something that was only for you, that no one else benefited from?" I thought about it honestly. I went back through the weeks trying to find an example. I could not find one. This is the moment I want you to hold on to, because it is the moment I started watching myself from the outside. Not immediately acting, I was too tired to act immediately, but watching, starting to count things, starting to notice the gap between what I was giving and what was coming back. The financial piece came later, and it came the way everything else had come, gradually, reasonably, wrapped in logic that was hard to argue with because each individual step seemed sensible. David mentioned around month 10 that it might make sense to fully combine our finances. Easier to manage, he said. More transparent. Linda had actually suggested it. She was very organized about money, had always managed the household finances when David was growing up, and she thought it would simplify things considerably. I agreed because I was tired, and it seemed practical, and I trusted him, and I had not yet developed the specific alertness that exhaustion eventually forced on me. Within a few months, Linda was present at the Sunday morning account reviews that David had established. She had opinions, delivered always with the same warm, concerned tone, concern for our financial health, concern for our future, concern that we were spending wisely. The gym membership I no longer used, wasteful to keep paying for it. The skincare I ordered every 2 months. She could show me more affordable alternatives. The occasional dinner out with Sarah. These things add up, you know. Every suggestion was reasonable on its own. Every suggestion was delivered with what looked like genuine care. And every suggestion, I eventually understood, was pointed in the same direction, away from me. Away from anything I was spending on myself, for myself, because of myself. Nobody suggested cutting Linda's yoga membership. Nobody raised an eyebrow at the Tuesday lunches or the Saturday farmer's market or the $400 living room curtains she had ordered without asking because she had seen them online and thought that they would look lovely, and she had been right. They did look lovely, and I had said nothing because what was there to say? I noticed. I kept noticing. I kept the count running in the back of my mind while the front of my mind managed dinner and laundry and groceries and the household accounts that I contributed 70% of and had less and less access to. And then one afternoon my doctor called about my blood work, and I drove to the pharmacy after work and stood at the counter with a $12 supplement in my hand. And my card declined. And my husband, before I could finish a sentence, told me his mother had already weighed in on whether I needed it. I put the bottle back. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for exactly as long as it took me to understand that I was done. Then I drove to the bank. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the test in my hand, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, something that was entirely mine. Not connected to the household or the schedule or the account reviews or Linda's opinions about how I spent money. Just mine. A small, quiet, absolute thing that belonged to no one else yet. I held it for a few minutes before I told anyone. I think I knew even then that everything was about to change, not in the way I hoped, in the way that the truth has of surfacing when something important enough arrives to force it up. David was happy, genuinely, warmly happy in the way he was capable of being when something moved him past his usual careful management of his own emotions. He held me and said things that I believed because in that moment they were true, that he was going to be present, that things would be different, that this was the beginning of something real. Linda's response was different. She found out that same evening. David told her over dinner he was too happy to wait, too full of it to hold it in, and I watched her face when he said it. There was a beat, just a single beat where her expression did something unplanned. A fractional rearrangement that lasted less than a second before the warmth came back up and she said all the right things. Congratulations! How wonderful! She was so happy for us. But I had seen that beat. I had learned by then to watch for the beat. The first month was fine. She asked about my symptoms with what seemed like genuine concern. She offered to take over more of the cooking since I was tired, which I accepted gratefully and which felt, briefly, like the dynamic shifting into something more bearable. She came with us to the first appointment and sat in the waiting room, and when we came out she hugged me and said she was so excited to be a grandmother. I wanted to believe it. I had been wanting to believe things about Linda for 2 years, and the wanting was a habit I had not yet fully broken. The second month is when the comments started. They were small at first, the way her comments always started small. She mentioned, while I was eating breakfast one morning, that she had read that excessive caffeine was dangerous in pregnancy, and she noticed I was still having my morning coffee, and she just wanted to make sure I knew. I